Hi sewing friends, welcome to my sewing room. My name is Beth, and if you're new, welcome. I needed a very quick baby quilt. I found out that my cousin's son's wife had a baby, and of course I want to send a baby quilt as quick as I can, and so today I'm going to finish this quilt up, and tomorrow I'll be putting it in the mail. Let's get started. I want to make this quilt quickly, and thankfully I have some batting and I have a large piece of this fabric I'm going to use for the backing, and I have a closet full of quilt tops. As you know, I don't always I should say, finish my quilts. I make a lot of quilt tops and I do quilt blocks and quite a bit of quilting here on my channel, but I don't always complete the quilt. They fit just a lot better in my closet when they're not as bulky. So I pulled out this quilt top, a very simple quilt top, and I have a video from, I think it's been 3 years since I made a quilt using this design. I'll leave a link below on the design for this quilt. It uses 6-inch squares, and the cornerstones and strips are all 3 inches and then 3 inches by 6 inches, and it's a really easy quilt to put together. There's a scrappy, those yellow strips are scrappy, as well as the lavender cornerstones, but the large squares are all the same fabric. The fabric for those squares is really sweet with those birds. The first thing I'm going to do is spray a little bit of the 505 adhesive spray onto my batting, and I'll smooth the quilt top right on top. And I don't use a lot of the spray, just a little bit. It doesn't take much. And as you can see, the batting is a little bit bigger than my quilt top. That's the way I typically put my quilts together, just to give a little wiggle room, and it's just easier to place the quilt top on the batting when you don't have to be too precise about placing it. After I finished putting the top on the batting, I turned my quilt over, and I'll do the same thing with the backing fabric. I'll spray the batting and I will smooth the backing fabric right on top. I finished putting my quilt sandwich together. That didn't take very long at all. So now I'm going to do some machine quilting on my Juki. I'm going to be kind of rolling my quilt. I'll be quilting the diagonal, so I'm going to start in one corner and roll half of the quilt up, and I'll begin in one corner and I will quilt through the center. I'm going to give my self a bigger stitch, and I'm using the all-purpose foot. I know that some machines probably would do better with a walking foot, but I found on my machine that my all-purpose foot works pretty well, and my walking foot is here, and you can see I wrote slow down because I think it needs to go a little bit slower, otherwise I think you damage that walking foot. So I'll use my all-purpose foot, and I'll begin in the center and sew all the way through the middle of my quilt. Once I was done sewing through one direction, I'm going through the large and small squares, and I'm eyeballing that line through those squares. I turned my quilt the other direction so that I will have lines going both directions diagonally through my quilt. All the lines are in now. That didn't take very long at all. And I'm going to trim the edge of my quilt using the quilt as my guide. I'll trim away the excess batting and backing with that long ruler and my rotary cutter. This backing fabric has lines going through, pink lines. They're a little bit hard to see here maybe, but I was very happy that they lined up really nicely with my quilt. I found a beautiful lavender fabric for my binding, and I'm cutting my strips 2.5 inches wide. I had all of my strips cut. I joined them together into one long piece of binding. Once I had my long piece of binding ready, I pressed the whole strip in half. I'm going to attach the binding to the back of my quilt, and then I'll be rolling it to the front. But to start with, I leave a long tail about 12 inches or so, and I begin attaching it to the back, and this is called a continuous binding. When I get all the way around, I'll connect the two tails. Here I am starting on one of the sides, and I'm going to sew all the way down to the corner, but I'm going to stop about 1/4 inch from the corner, and I'm going to pivot and sew off of the corner. Here is the quilt binding almost before I finish that first side of the quilt. I'm going to stop and put my needle down lift the foot and then sew off the corner. This makes a really nice corner for the binding. And then I turn my quilt to begin the next side. I lift the binding up and then I fold down right on that corner and get a straight fold right across the top there, and then I'll begin sewing right on that fold, and I'll do the same thing all the way around. I stopped sewing about 12 inches from the beginning of where I started, and I'm going to cut off the excess binding there, but I need at least 2.5 inches there on the left, and I have more than enough. I'm going to open that piece of binding to measure 2.5 inches, and so that little tail that's left on the left is 2.5 inches, and I'm now going to put the right sides together, and I will sew these together just like I did when the binding was, when I was attaching it together. I will put the right sides together sort of at an angle, and again I'll do that diagonal seam. I have to kind of bunch the quilt up a little bit to get this together, and after I pin, I'll put my seam in. After I put my binding together here, those two tails together, I always like to double check and make sure that it's not twisted and that it fits correctly. Then I always pin this little section so that I can get it together on that quilt. It fits and I get a smooth seam. So I'll pin and then I'll finish sewing, and my binding will be on the back, and then I'll be ready to turn it to the front and top stitch all the way around. I've turned my quilt over, and now all I have to do is wrap that binding over to the front and top stitch all the way around. Here's my finished quilt. I need to add a label. I'll fold it up and I'll put a ribbon around this, put it in the mail, and hopefully it will arrive quickly to the new baby in Kentucky. Thanks for joining me today, and I'll see you next time.